So as we now turn our attention to section 134, this is a fascinating section, like we mentioned before, on a variety of levels. One, because Joseph Smith doesn't receive it as a revelation. It's written probably by Oliver Cowdery as he delivers it to a group in Kirtland when Joseph and Frederick G. Williams aren't even in the town. And it's accepted by unanimous vote to be included as part of the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph Smith later on is going to approve that vote.
And the intention here is actually, it's almost like a declaration of belief and not necessarily like, here's this revelation from God. So we want to be careful here because there's important principles here, but it's different than other sections.
Yeah, and part of the problem that we wrestle with in section 134 is the fact that Oliver Cowdery has been through an awful lot of persecution, and he hasn't had the law to help uphold his rights and his freedoms and his liberties as a citizen of the United States. Because keep in mind, Oliver Cowdery was living in Jackson County, Missouri during 1833 when the mob started doing all of the abuse of those members of the church and expelling them from Jackson County in the fall of 1833. He has seen the struggles of Zion's camp, and that failed to get them back onto their lands. And they've made redress to the government. And so you can understand from their perspective where he's coming from in giving this declaration of belief regarding government and law. At the same time, there have been some who have struggled with this section because he shares these perspectives from a constitutionalist perspective of, say, James Madison or Thomas Jefferson. But at the same time, we have to understand that people like Madison and Jefferson and Franklin and George Washington and others, they had recognized that they weren't being given these freedoms and liberties, and so they willingly made themselves traitors to their country and committed treason in order to try to establish a new nation and a new government to uphold these very things that they weren't being given. And yet in this section, like when you get to verse 12, he, at the very, very end, the last verse, he gives an example of, we do not believe it right to interfere with the bondservants, neither preach the gospel to nor baptize them contrary to the will and wish of their masters, nor to meddle with or influence them in the least to cause them to be dissatisfied with their situations in this life. That kind of runs opposite to what Madison and Jefferson and Washington did.
Or even what the gospel's about. And if you look at the context for Oliver Cowdery, one of the reasons that the members of the church were run out of Missouri was in part because of their open acceptance that slaves could or should be freed and were welcome into the gospel. And that created such a political problem that Oliver adds us in that the safer approach would be, let's not interfere with slavery and let's let it be the way it is. And I suppose if we got to talk to Oliver Cowdery today with a long perspective, he might say, you know, maybe we should have been a little more proactive about this. So we have to be a little careful to not fully, to totally judge people in the past based on our present circumstances, but to understand their perspective. But I guess get to the point that the principles here about government ultimately mean, well, those who are in slavery should be liberated and given the same opportunities for freedom. And might we add that freedom is an ongoing thing. We have in the Declaration of Independence, we have in the Constitution in order to form a more perfect union. Now, we want to recognize we're speaking from the United States here today. There are other countries with different approaches. But when we say a more perfect union, it's not like we've achieved perfect government. And there's always ways of improving the world. And we might think that everything's been achieved that could be good to be achieved. And the invitation is wherever somebody is being oppressed or having less freedom than others, we have an opportunity to spread the light and goodness of God's truth to help liberate more people for more opportunity to become their better selves.
And so if you go back to verse 1, this is a beautiful opening to this section. We believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and administering them for the good and safety of society. This is a pretty powerful declaration of belief that God has ordained these governments, but he's going to hold them accountable. What are governments there for? They are, verse 2, to secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life, all of which were taken away from members of the church in 1833 in Missouri, and Oliver lived through it.
Right.
Then look at verse 4. We believe that religion is instituted of God. Did you catch the connection between verse 1 and 4? Governments were instituted of God. Verse 4, religion is instituted of God, and that men are amenable to him and to him only for the exercise of it. And he talks about how your religious opinions can't infringe on the rights, freedoms, and liberties of other people, or you've stepped over a line. And law at that point, or government, needs to come in and protect that group who has been diminished or abused in any way, shape, or form. Recognizing that in the 1833 Jackson County context, much of the mob experience was fueled by preachers of other religions. And you put this all in its context, and you can feel the frustration of these saints saying this was not fair, what was done.
It was a massive injustice. And we live in a day where perhaps we're not in those same circumstances, where we might ask ourselves, Lord, is it I? Am I ever denying people their right of conscience, their right of worship? And I'm sure we all could probably find situations where we felt a little bit impinged upon, but we also want to be careful. It's not simply about hoping other people protect our rights, but it's all about us being responsible to protect other people's rights as well.
And then one of the aspects in Section 134 that is a critical element in moving forward in peaceful ways is contained in verse 5. We believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments, and that sedition and rebellion are unbecoming every citizen, thus protected. But you'll notice if Madison and Jefferson and Washington were there, they would say, we were not given those rights. Our freedoms and our liberties were not being protected. That's why we rose up in rebellion against the King of England at the time. So then you'll notice at the very end of verse 5, he says that all governments have a right to enact such laws as is in their own judgments are best calculated to secure the public interest. At the same time, however, holding sacred the freedom of conscience. That's a beautiful juxtaposition to try to figure out where you find that middle ground between what's best for the public and still holding sacred the freedom of individual conscience.
And it's an ongoing conversation around the good of society as well as individual rights and responsibilities. And I don't think we'll ever get to a final conclusion about the best way to do things. And so it's important as members of God's kingdom and as citizens wherever we are to be thoughtfully engaged with those around us around issues that matter, to become well-informed and do what we can to expand people's agency while also protecting their rights and privileges and also being responsible with that.